So I've been looking around on YouTube lately, trying to find a tutorial for walking footstep sounds in platformer mode in GD 2.2. And the best thing I've found so far is a tutorial that basically told you to do this, which is get some touch trigger sound effects triggers and just put them like this. And then that's it. And don't get me wrong, if this is a classic level, that would be fine, but this is a platformer level that we're trying to do. So I'm going to show you how to actually do it and make it better. So I'm going to show you what I think is much better, because I want to make it specifically so that whenever the foot of my robot touches the ground, a sound effect is played. So in order to do that, we need to satisfy two criteria. Number one, we need to detect if the player is on the ground, and number two, we need to detect if the player is moving. If they are on the ground and moving, then therefore they must be walking. So how do we check that? Well, first, let's start off with being able to check things at all. So in order to do that, we need to check very, very frequently. So I would say 50 times a second would probably be good. So we're going to make something that I call a step loop. It's a specific kind of spawn loop that is very, very fast. So I'm going to set this spawn trigger to activate group ID 2. And I'm going to give it a delay of 0.01, which is 1/100th of a second. I'm going to check spawn trigger and multi-trigger. And I'm going to duplicate that, set this group ID to 1, to activate group ID 1. This is going to be group ID 1, and this is going to be group ID 2, not parented. Group ID 2. And I'm going to start that up by, I don't need a delay actually, I'm just going to start that up by putting a spawn trigger here, and now we have a step loop. So the reason it's called a step loop is because this is the left step and this is the right step, and they alternate. They oscillate very quickly, and you will be able to notice that if I put a sound effect trigger here, and I'm going to put just that same sound effect that I was using before, because why not? I'll put it on volume 0.2, because it's going to happen very fast. I forgot to put it in the group. Yeah, you can, yeah, it's very fast. So, this happens 50 times a second, each step. The left step and the right step each happen 50 times a second. So there are 100 steps in 1 second, and they alternate. The reason this is useful is because sometimes you want things to happen very, very frequently, but you don't necessarily want them to always happen at the exact same time. So you can put, I'd say, most things probably on the left step, which is group 1 in this case, and some things occasionally in the right step, which is group 2 in this case. So how exactly does this help us? Well, we want to detect if the player is on the ground, first of all. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some of these collision blocks, I'm going to set them to collision ID 1, and I'm going to move them about 2 notches above the ground. I'm going to duplicate that and put them all across the ground here. So now I'm going to put an instant collision here, and I'm going to make it group 1. So this is going to activate on every left step, and this instant collision trigger is going to check if player 1 collides with collision block ID 1. And it's going to do spawn trigger and multi-trigger. And if that happens, we're going to set an item ID. Let's set item ID 1 to be 1, but override it though. And spawn trigger, multi-trigger. The reason it's important that it is override is override makes it so that instead of incrementing the counter by 1, it's going to directly set the value to 1. Which is important because we only want it to be either 0 or 1. We need it to be 0 as a value of false, the player is not on the ground, or 1, which is true, the player is on the ground. So this we're going to set to group ID 3, and we're also going to have another one, which is group ID 4, and this one is going to set it to 0, because we want the true ID, if the player is touching these collision blocks, to be 3, and if it's false, it activates 4, which will set the count to 0. I'm also going to put this counter here, which will look at item ID 1. And as you can see, if we are touching the ground, the value is 1, and if we are not touching the ground, then it is value 0. So the amazing thing about item IDs is that they are basically variables, and that is essentially what I've used it as here. I've basically used these as variables, and I'm going to continue to use that. So use that a lot to your advantage. So now we can detect if the player is on the ground. The second criteria that we need to check for is if the player is moving. And in order to check that, we need an event trigger. So basically, this event trigger right here is going to detect if left or right is pushed. And if it is, next free is 5, so let's activate group ID 5. And then we're going to have another one, which is going to activate group 6 if left or right are released. So now we are detecting if the left or right button is pushed. And if it is, we want to increment another item ID, use another variable, by 1. We don't want to override it this time, because if the player is holding right and then they press left briefly and then release left, then even though they are still holding right, the counter will go back to 0. So we actually want to increment it this time. Spawn trigger, multi-trigger, put this on group 5. We have another one, which is group 6, and that's going to decrease the count by -1. So now that we have this set up, we have a value that will be 0 if we aren't pressing anything, and a value that will be above 0 if we are pressing left or right, or any combination of that. And I'm going to display that here. I keep pressing edit object. That is not what you press. So it's sometimes 2. But the one thing that we care about is that it is 0 only when we aren't pressing anything. So now, how can we use these two values? We have a value that will be 1 if we are touching the ground, and a value that will be above 0 when we are moving. So we can combine these two. So let's have an instant count trigger that will check if item ID 1 is equal to 1, and in that case we're going to activate a group. What is next free? It is 7. And is going to activate group 7, and this is going to happen every left step. So now let's have another instant count trigger, which is going to check item ID 2, and we're going to check if it's larger than 0. Remember, that checks if it's moving. We're going to activate target ID 8. We're going to set this to be 7, because that's what this is activating. So this one is going to activate this one, and then this one performs a check, then this one performs a check, and now once both of those checks have succeeded, we have now verified that the player is on the ground and moving. So if I put a pickup trigger here, and I set it to be ID 8, I can do a new item ID, I can set the count to be 1, spawn trigger, multi-trigger, and also we want to be able to set it to false if either of these conditions are ever false. So let's do instant count. If it equals 0, then let's activate ID 9. Let's also take this one here, and let's make it check item ID 2, see if it's equal to 0. Let that also activate target ID 9. And then let's have both of these in group 1, which is every left step. So now if either of those criteria are not satisfied, it will activate this pickup trigger here, which will override item ID 3 to be 0. So now if I put a counter down here, we will see that it will be 1 if both conditions are met, and it will be 0 if they're not. If I'm in the air and moving, it is still 0, and if I'm on the ground and not moving, it's 0. And that is exactly what we want. So now what can we do with this? Well, your first thought might be to use a spawn trigger, and so the robot's foot touches the ground about every quarter of a second, so every 0.25 seconds. So your initial thought might be, let's take an instant count trigger and make it check item ID 3, check if it is equal to 1. Let's put that on the left step. And then with that, let's put a spawn trigger here. What is next free? It is 10. So you will be 10. Activate this one. And you will activate 11 with a delay of 0.25. And let's put a sound effects trigger here. Yeah, that doesn't work. Now, you could put a cooldown in there, but I'm just going to tell you straight up that it's not going to work. Because the spawn trigger will spawn something, like, no matter what. Like, even if you stop walking within the 0.25 seconds delay that the spawn trigger has, it's still going to play that sound effect after that delay, even though you have already stopped walking. That isn't what we want. So what we do want is we only want to play the sound effect when we're walking. So I have a fix for that. So let's put an instant count trigger here. We actually still need this. I shouldn't have deleted it, but whatever. Next free is 10, I think. Yep. Spawn trigger, multi-trigger, and we're actually going to put this on 1 and 2. Every left and right step, which means this activates on every step 100 times every single second. So what are we going to do with that? Well, we're going to use a pickup trigger here. I'm going to give it ID 10. And we're actually going to make a new item ID and decrease its counter by 1. Going to make that spawn trigger and multi-trigger. And let's have another counter here, displaying that. So right now it goes to a negative number. So why exactly have I done this? Well, what we want to do is we want to increment a counter only when we have both criteria satisfied. We only want the timer to be ticking down when we are moving and on the ground. And the spawn trigger just cannot do that for us. Like, its spawn delay, it just can't do that for us. So we have to implement this behavior ourselves. And in order to do that, I have made a counter decrease while we have both criteria satisfied. That is useful because I can make it so that if this count, if item ID 4 is smaller than 1, I can activate a group. I think 11. Yeah, 11. Spawn trigger, multi-trigger. I'm going to make this also left trigger and right trigger, or left step and right step. And if it is smaller than 1, we are going to basically reset that count, make this 11, and let's make this count now 25. Let's override that. So now, the count is basically just going to loop between 25. So why 25? Well, as I said before, this happens 100 times a second, this right here. So if we set it to 25 and it decreases 100 times a second, then by the time it gets down to 0, 25 hundredths of a second, or a quarter of a second, has passed, which is the exact amount of time that it takes between each footstep of the robot. However, it is kind of weird, because, you know, even when I stop, the number that shows up is pretty much just random. Like, here we've got 15, then we got 4, then we got 8, then we got 6. I mean, the robot's animation doesn't start randomly each time. It's the same every time. So how can we fix that? let's make it so that if these criteria aren't met, let's make this, let's make it 5. Let's override 4 with count of 5. So now it's 5 whenever we don't have both criteria met. So what can we do with that? We have this here that sets the count to 25, but at the same time it resets that count back to 25, we're going to play a sound effect. We're going to play a footstep. Dirt 01, and we're going to give it ID 11. And now, we've done it. That's it. You now have walking sound effects. However, that isn't completely the whole thing. If I have another surface here, and I put these over top of it, it's still going to make the same sound, of course. And you may have noticed that I did not use the material ID at all. I did not use the material ID, and that is because, frankly, with this system that I've got here, I don't know a way to make it useful. But I can do the next best thing. I can make another system. So let's duplicate all of these collision triggers here. Let's take this, let's give it a collision ID of 2 and a collision ID of 3. And let's put these back on there, and let's make this more dirt looking. Let's give it a brown color. That looks brown enough to me. So we've got dirt, and we also have this here, which is collision ID 3, and then this is collision ID 2. So with that, we are going to detect with an instant collision trigger on group 11. We're going to detect if P1 is colliding with collision block ID 2. Spawn trigger multi-trigger, and if it's true, we will activate group 12. We'll have another one, which is block ID 3. And if the player is colliding with block ID 3, then activate group 13. So let's put a sound effects trigger with group 12. Get a dirt sound effect in there. Spawn trigger multi-trigger. And let's take another one here. Let's do Run Stone 3. Sure. Group 13. And now we have stone sounds. We have different sound effects for different surfaces. And you can continue this. You can make a huge stack here if you want to, for as many surfaces as you want. You can adjust the volume, maybe choose some sound effects to randomize, change which sound effects are used, but basically that's everything you have to do. So I hope that was helpful. See ya.